Welcome to MojoPlays, and today we're looking at bosses from video games that later became regular enemies, whether within the same game or a sequel.
Jesus, that thing was angry. Data?
But before we begin, we publish new content all week long, so be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. The Missionary, Silent Hill 3. The Silent Hill series features a ton of twisted bosses that thankfully only show up once, but the Missionary from Silent Hill 3 is a little different. He appears early on in the game, having been commanded to take the life of Heather Mason's father before trying to dispose of her. His quick reflexes can be problematic, even able to block bullets. Many more like him show up during the climax at the Order's Chapel. Referred to as Scrapers, these versions are much weaker than the Missionary, but retain the same high speed that can still result in a quick demise if players aren't careful.
Don't stand there looking so smug. You're the worst person in this room.
Vampire, Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy repurposes bosses into enemies fairly frequently, but for this list, we're going back to the beginning. In the original game, the Warriors of Light square off against a vampire boss at the end of the Cavern of Earth dungeon, which actually isn't too hard of a fight. However, the Bloodsuckers start appearing during random encounters later in the game. Ever since then, vampires have shown up in abundance throughout multiple entries, usually with different attacks and abilities. However, with the exception of some spin-offs, they've mostly stayed as regular enemies. It makes sense considering the franchise has long since been more interested in creating its own, more unique monsters. Sheoth, Metroid Prime. Samus fights a lot of unique creatures in Metroid Prime, including shelled ice lizards whose pissed-off mother tries to make her regret it. Players fight Sheoth in the Chapel of the Elders in order to unlock the Wave Beam. Unlike her children, Mama Sheoth can only be hurt when her mouth is open after emitting her ice breath. However, upon future visits to the Phendrana Drifts, Samus will have to deal with Sheoths on a regular basis, as they'll become recurring enemies. While they won't have gotten any weaker, Samus will have gotten significantly stronger, making facing them much more manageable. Cyber Demon, Doom series. Doom is another series that changes the status of its enemies from game to game, but we're going with one of the franchise's most recognizable baddies, the Cyber Demon. This goat-like behemoth with a fondness for rockets appeared as a boss in the first game, but in Doom 2, it was demoted to a more commonly occurring enemy. It then went back up to boss for both Doom 3 and the 2016 reboot. However, its latest appearance was of the more common variety, in a way. The Tyrants of Doom Eternal aren't exactly the same, but they're similar in appearance and moveset, while the Cyber Demon doesn't appear at all. Capra Demon, Dark Souls. Sticking with goat demons, let's talk about Dark Souls. Although it's an optional boss fight, players can find the Capra Demon early on in the Undead Burg. And like many other From Software fights, it can be a pretty big pain. One of the problems is the location. Tight spot with little room to maneuver in. There's also the boss's canine companions, which if not taken care of immediately, will do everything in their power to make their master victorious. Players can take out their frustrations on a whole pack of them later though, inside the demon ruins. Yes, you'll be stronger, but you'll also have a lot more room so you don't get cheaply smashed into oblivion. Ogre, Dragon Age Origins. Ogres are mighty creatures in most fantasy, and so Dragon Age Origins kicks off with a bang with its first boss. As you reach the end of the Tower of Ishal, the intimidating ogre will dwarf your party members in size. But more importantly, you also won't have much in terms of power to deal with it easily. Thankfully, as you build up your team and the ogres become a less rare occurrence, you can take appropriate levels of vengeance on them. BioWare actually did the same thing in Dragon Age 2, making an ogre the first boss before relegating them to regular enemies. Tripod, Dead Space 2. It's hard to decide on the most disturbing necromorph design, but the tripod from Dead Space 2 is certainly alarming. Standing on 3 legs, it is several bodies stitched together, which Isaac has the unfortunate honor of meeting as the first boss. However, as is the case with most survival horror, Isaac builds up the power of his weaponry throughout the game. So when tripods start appearing more frequently later in the game, players can lay into them with as much ferocity as they desire. They're still freakish as hell, but at least you can keep them well out of reach with enough firepower. Dongo, The Legend of Zelda series. Like Final Fantasy, the Zelda series has demoted and promoted bosses and enemies across many games. But again, we're sticking with the roots. The Dongo is the second boss you face in the original game, but it later appears in 2 other dungeons as a regular enemy. While King Dongo is also the second boss in Ocarina of Time, there are multiple smaller ones that are used as enemies. Interestingly, the Dongo would move back up to a boss in Oracle of Ages and Four Swords Adventures, but it would be back to a lowly grunt by the release of Twilight Princess. Bloater, The Last of Us. As Joel, Ellie, and Bill are chased through a school full of infected, they bar themselves inside the gym. But out of the pan and into the fire, as they say. At this moment, The Last of Us introduces its most horrific enemy yet. While there's no title card or health bar, the Bloater gets a special intro, is fought in an arena, takes a lot of firepower to go down, and, one of the cheaper boss tactics, summons minions. However, you'll come across bloaters several more times in packs of infected. But, except for Ellie's solo chapter, you'll have upgraded your arsenal along the way, making them easier to deal with. Slyra and Gybon, Castlevania series. These 2 Castlevania foes are often linked, and have therefore shared a fate of being demoted across the series. They first appeared in Super Castlevania 4, being 2 of the bosses faced right before Dracula, meaning they weren't easy. Slyra's deadly leaps could be tough to avoid, Gybon rained stalactites down on you, and they both loved using fireballs. But they've become weaker and weaker ever since. They were the first bosses of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, before appearing as regular enemies later in the game. Since then, from Curse of Darkness to Harmony of Despair, Slyra and Gybon have merely been minor obstacles on the way to actual bosses. Know of any other bosses that were downgraded to enemies?
It must be this way. One day you'll understand why.
Share them with us in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to MojoPlays for more great gaming videos every day.